I am very pleased to be talking today with Mr. Joseph Corazzini, Assistant Superintendent of Equity, Diversity, and Community Engagement for Framingham Public Schools in Framingham, Massachusetts. Mass Insight conducted an equity audit with Framingham that was completed over this past summer. And I'm going to be asking Joe more about Framingham's work, the equity audit process, what's happened in Framingham since the report was released, and advice he has for others who might be considering equity audits. So Joe, I am so pleased to have you joining us. Thank you for making the time. I know time is always precious in school systems, and particularly in our current conditions with the pandemic. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Happy
And
to
I'm
be
going
here.
to start by asking you to ground us in the context. Tell us about the Framingham community and district, and what made last year the right time to invest in an equity audit in Framingham.
Well, first, let me say thank you for allowing me to meet with you and to have this conversation. So Framingham's an amazing community. It's prior to the transition over to a city. It was the largest town in the country, predominantly made up about 69% white, 7% black, around 16% Hispanic or Latino. And it's probably a little bit more diverse, giving sort of the large breadth of the resilient community that exists within Framingham, and often them not identifying with Hispanic as sort of an identity and checking sort of the box on white. So it's an extremely diverse community. What we've seen is, you have a number of things happening in terms of, the people being priced out of Greater Boston, immigrant families coming to this country, specifically coming to Framingham, looking for employment, looking for stability in terms of connection with families or friends who are existing here. And so as a school district, we're seeing a rapid increase in terms of the level of diversity of our students of color within Framingham. And naturally, part of that process requires a different focus and lens around strategies that are specifically tailored to those demographics to ensure equitable access to, high quality education. And so part of what sort of led to this work was we really had a strong equity subcommittee and school committee that wanted to prioritize equity as a function of our principles and our core values. And so probably about a couple of years back, they established an equity subcommittee and determined that they needed to be an actual audit that was independently done by an outside organization to give some critical feedback to the district around areas that we're struggling in, areas that we might have some success in, and then strategies for moving some of this work forward in an intentional way.
So Joe, now I'm going to ask you more about the audit process and what actually took place in Framingham. And if I'm not mistaken, you all engaged us for an equity audit prior to the pandemic, but then the pandemic hit during the audit process. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about if this is the case, how did the pandemic shift any of the priorities for the process and the process itself?
So the process for us initially began, you know, getting ready for the actual audit, professional development and training for our administration team, so we can begin to be ready for some of these challenging conversations that were going to come, right? Because
Nice.
when you start talking about diversity and inclusion and equity, then you need to realize institutionally that there's been a history that you have either unintentionally participating in, and you're right, like it could be like within your own administration or prior to your administration, that folks have some feelings about, right? And so one of the things we talk about with institutional leaders is owning, right, the hats that we wear. And so as as somebody who works in a public education institution, I have to own the legacy of oppression that has perpetuated within the community that has led many to feel like education is not a real doorway for them. So doing this sort of professional development and training with your team to get them ready was sort of the first step. Next step is sort of crafting the actual RFP, if you will, in terms of how are we going, what do we want to focus on, what questions do we want answered, how do we carve out an actual proposal in terms of the RFP, where it's not too broad, because everybody asks a million and one questions, but really what you want to focus on is sort of like narrowing the focus so you can identify specific areas that you can dig deeper into. Once Mass Insight came on board and was working with us, we were able to pass along a lot of data and information. I mean, any and every report that I could find from the last 5 years or for earlier, I would give to Francina to share with the team, so that way they can begin to have a greater sort of conceptualization of like what's actually taking place in Framingham, what are the changing demographics, what are some of the initiatives that have happened in the past, because all that works to influence sort of like their interpretation in terms of what they're noticing in terms of consistency or inconsistency with some of our practices. We moved from there to the interviews with students, and well, we started actually with administrators and principals and staff, and then transitioned to interviews with community partners, students, families. And we were specific around the community partner piece because they oftentimes have a stronger sense, because they work so much with the district and different families who are experiencing levels of hardship. They, don't necessarily feel the same level of fear, if you will, in terms of vocalizing some of the issues or concerns. And two, they can understand from a conceptual level, like where some of those consistencies start to pop up. And so their feedback was critical in terms of really understanding sort of like where are the places you're seeing consistency in terms of certain demographics of individuals struggling or not being able to access services or resources. COVID was hard because COVID threw off our whole, our focus groups, our individual recruitment for students. The teacher recruitment and the staff recruitment was much easier because people were so willing to participate. I'd say that the one challenge is that when you're doing this work, people are very skeptical because they're like, do you really want to hear this information? You want to hear about how things are not great? You want to hear about people feel marginalized or otherized?
And are you going to act on it?
Yeah. And are you going to act on it? Right. So, like trust is huge within this process. And I think in maintaining that, like, one, being very transparent with your with the data when it comes back and the details of it is important. And two, like having an administration that's committed to actually being in supporting and verbalizing, showcasing like a commitment to protecting the integrity of the process and not dismissing any of the communications that come in from staff members. Because, I think what we've seen from a process is people that have not spoken up before within the district, who've been here for a long time, beginning to unearth and share now more consistently some of the challenges that they've experienced over their tenure here, which is great because even as challenging as it is, it gives us a place to start from in terms of working to address those issues and those concerns. So COVID threw us off a little bit. I would have loved to have more incentives for students because they were so fatigued by like the online learning and the impact of COVID so early on that it became really challenging. I mean, we went through a lot of different strategies with the Mass Insight team on like how to recruit kids, how to incentivize it for them to want to participate. And at the end of the day, it was really challenging to get a number of them to show up for the focus groups. And so, we were able to get some students and it worked out and the survey responses were great from students.
Yeah.
But the COVID really made it challenging for students because students, it's easier for me to say pizza in the cafeteria after school,
Right.
like all the kids show up, and they're very forthcoming and willing to engage in the conversation.
Yeah, virtual pizza doesn't quite cut it, right?
Exactly.
So, Joe, I want to unpack some of what you said because you gave great information. So, starting back at the beginning on the professional development. So, what I think I heard you saying was you had to really lay a groundwork or a foundation to create receptivity for some of the conversations that this process was going to surface and the information. So if I heard you correctly, that's what I heard. And then I'm wondering if I'm right, and if I'm not, correct me. So having worked in school systems myself, so there is a lot of systemic racism built into these systems, and many practitioners are deeply socialized into that system, rightly or wrongly. So just say a little more, if you would, about how you and your colleagues in Framingham started building that kind of, I don't know if it's the receptivity, the openness, the kind of ability maybe to look at things and hear things differently. Tell us more about that.
So some of that I feel like was, one is it starts with the leadership team. So it really starts with the superintendent. The superintendent has to feel comfortable in in being the example for the district around what vulnerability is. And we had some really strong trainings, professional development. Our superintendent, Dr. Tremblay, who's phenomenal, he's been very vocal in this work about his own work that he had to do in terms of this work and his own path. And, to the point where we have, I guess talk about it later, but like we're actually doing intensive, 6-month training for all of our administrators for anti-racism, right? It includes affinity groups and conversations with with all of our white administrators, and the conversations with our administrators of color, and then cross conversations with both of the groups, because we have to be able to practice for kids and model the behavior that we want to see. And so, when we're engaging in this work, it's important that we're reflective and that we're thoughtful, but it's also important that we're courageous in terms of knowing that you're never going to feel comfortable in a lot of this work. I don't want people to feel comfortable. I want you to be engaged and to feel and to recognize that you have skill sets, right? And we can work on furthering those development of those skill sets, but there's skills that folks inherently we can train them on, that will make them feel maybe more comfortable, but more importantly, give them the tools that they need to be able to engage in this level of work. Because it's important people to understand that, like, whether the history of this country is built on slavery and oppression, right? And so that lives in every institution, because when institutions were developed and created, they were created with policies and practices that inherently otherize and oppress some, and then supported and uplifted others, right? And it doesn't matter if it was 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 50 years ago, those policies still leave a legacy. And part of doing this work is to understand that legacy and unpack it, right? Because the same way which and there's an intersection between and this is important, there's an intersection between oppression, where like there might be a place where I identify in terms of, or the world identifies me like as a man, where I face opportunities of privilege, right? There's ways in which the world sees me and treats me in a certain way. This is privilege. But then there's an identity that I also carry as being Black, that comes with levels of oppression and history. So the intersection is like, how do we create the culture of understanding that our differences and, are actually places of unification? Like there's places where some of us face.
That's great. Okay.
There's places where some of us face oppression, right? And we've got to be able to dig into those places where we, with our colleagues and our peers around that oppression, the same way we have to dig in on our places of our privilege, because they're inherently connected. Because if one person is oppressed, right, then it creates oppression for all of us. Because as long as we're allowed to create a world where people can be oppressed, it threatens the ideals of freedom, right, and democracy.
That's right.
So
and our whole mantra of kind of equality in the American dream.
Oh yeah, you can't have equality if some folks aren't getting what they need and some folks are getting more than what they need.
That's right. Another thing you talked about, which I was hoping you'd amplify a bit, is this idea of the importance of trust and building trust, and hearing, I think I'm paraphrasing, but what I took away was, so you want to hear the voices of people who might have felt they were least likely to be asked, or least likely willing to contribute because of their distrust of the system in this process. Am I right about that?
Well, I think institutions say they want to hear it, but the truth is institutions do not want to hear it.
I think I agree with that. So how did you and others build that? So it's not like a switch, right? You can't just turn trust on after a real legacy in many cases of distrust. So how did you and others in Framingham start flipping that script, if you will, and building the trust needed to get people, families, community, students to engage in that conversation?
So, I mean, it's an ongoing process, right? Like I started tours in the listening tours. I called them Be Heard tours. And I shared some of that, my notes from that with the Mass Insight consultant. So essentially what I said to the community is, I put out SurveyMonkey and I said to community partners, and I did it to families. And I said, if you're a family and you can commit to getting 2 other families to your house, I'll give you an hour to 90 minutes of my time. And then you tell me what the topics are ahead of time. If
Right.
you need a translator. And I said, if it's like, because if it's going to be about bilingual programs, I'm going to invite the bilingual director. If it's going to be about special ed, I'm going to invite special ed director, assistant director. If it's going to be about diversity and inclusion, then I'll be there. I'll maybe extend an invitation to the superintendent. But I'll give you about 90 minutes of my time and allow you, and we'll work it out in terms of schedules.
Mm-hmm.
Come to the house.
Mm-hmm.
And engage in an honest dialogue and a conversation. You set the agenda, we come out, because like this is about relationship building. When you do this equity work, people often want to jump to like change the curriculum, change policies. The reality is that this work lives in culture shifting, and culture shifting happens within practice. So you can write as many policies as you want. How many people actually follow them or listen to them, I don't know, but I know that the practice, the way in which we're sort of cultured within our environments and our institutions, and we're socialized, like that is actually where sort of like a lot of this lives. Like, does a principal know how to respond in a way to a situation that makes the teacher feel comfortable, like it was respected and valued, that makes the student feel comfortable, that makes the family feel comfortable? Does the teacher know, right? If they're talking about the Holocaust and a student makes an inappropriate joke, does the teacher know how to respond to that student, to one, calibrate the space so that all students in the classroom know that that specific action was hurtful and wrong, and we're going to take a time to pause and address it, because we don't want to create a culture where we say knock it off, and then the kid who experienced the harm doesn't feel like it was addressed. It makes the family upset and triggers them because they went through the same experiences as the child. And then the student who actually committed the harm doesn't necessarily think that doesn't know to the extent what they did wrong. Right. So my philosophy is that you're not going to really fire too many kids or suspend them into becoming better people. We're going to educate and train people on how to live the core beliefs and values as us as a district. So our philosophy, my mission is like to engage people where they're at, to always assume best intentions, right? And if it's egregious, like we'll take the 1% of the issues we can set to the side, right? But the reality is that 99% of these issues, we can work through and showcase them, again, modeling our behaviors and practices, and then putting truth to power. So like if incidents are occurring in the community, capital, the attacks on some of the churches and the mosque and the temples, to actually put out statements and verbalize like, hey, like it's okay for us to talk about these issues. We inherently trust our teachers. Really, like we want them to understand that the engagement in this process helps to unpack and detach from this place of neutrality, political neutrality that schools have lived within. That's not actual political neutrality. What it is coded language that gives schools permission to step aside and ignore blatant discrimination and institutional biases that have led to the perpetuation of the oppression of communities of color and marginalized communities. And so we can't live in that space anymore. What we have to do is challenge ourselves through our practices each day to be vocal, to be present, and to be humble in terms of our approach. So that way, when people come back and say, it's not enough, like I'm always telling my team, like we have this conversation all the time. It's really hard when you're digging in, you're seeing yourself work hard. And so not everybody is necessarily fully aware or appreciative of your efforts to say, okay, like this is great that we got to this point, and I hear where they're coming from, and I'm not going to demonize them for pointing out our lack of within an area. I'm really going to focus in on trying to understand where they're coming from.
Okay, thanks. So having an audit is commendable. And then, of course, the goal of having an audit is that action is taken as a result of the information that's generated. And you started already to talk about some of the things that are now being done in Framingham. You mentioned specifically the affinity groups. So tell us a little more, if you would, about what's happened in Framingham since the audit. How have the district and stakeholders digested the report, and how has it informed decisions, interactions, and DEI progress in the district?
So part of what we did during the audit, and the timing just somehow happened to work out. I'll credit Dr. Tremblay, because when we were engaging in the audit, he also engaged separately with another consultant who does specifically strategic planning with DESE to help us think through our district improvement plan. And so what we did was to create a connection between the two consultants, Mass Insight and our other consultant, who could then look at sort of like what was coming in terms of some of the briefings and the report, to overlap the communications that were coming as part of the planning for the district improvement plan. So when you actually look at our district improvement plan, you'll see layered throughout, the major theme of it is equity, and everything is almost identical in terms of information that came from the actual audit. So as you look to the next 3 to 5 years in terms of planning within the district, the overlap of that is so strong that it's now taking sort of
That's
like
great.
equity audit out of this sort of silo and
Mhm.
embedded it within the actual institutional roadmap for the future. Um,
Great.
so to that end, again, it goes to leadership, right? We're in, halfway through our school year. This is the first time ever that we've had mandated professional development across the board for the district, and COVID has given us an opportunity to streamline some of this. So, the Zoom calls and the trainings and the Google Hangouts have allowed us to bring training and professional development to the district we haven't before. To date, right now, we have over 32 hours completed across the board in terms of staff of mandated anti-racism professional development. Never happened before.
Wow.
History of the
Okay.
district. We have, I talked earlier about our, a 6-month intensive mandated professional development for all administrators across the district in regards to racial equity and inclusion.
Yeah.
We've had, we're in our budget season, we're prioritizing equity initiatives through our funding. We're rolling out programs in terms of universal pre-K, equity driven, right? 26% of our kids who come into the district that don't have any pre-K programs, we're looking at, an aggressive approach of 2 to 3 years to eliminate that gap completely.
That's great.
Phenomenal work. We're working on a teacher pathway residency program with partnership with Framingham State. We're working on, our office teaching learning is working on reviewing our curriculum maps to ensure that they're inclusive of multiple perspectives. We have teachers who are taking, diversity, equity initiative, DEI groups that are happening at individual school levels. We're in the process of developing a coordinated district team, in addition to our equity subcommittee with the school committee, that helps to collaborate and coordinate between some of those different groups. That way, because what you want to happen in your district is you want organically for some schools to be able to take off and run. Some are going to walk, some are going to run, but you want at the district level to have a lens about all the things that are happening. So the work is just sort of like exploding in terms of, and some of it is a lot of it's organic, but some of it's also sort of been accelerated because of some of the things that have been happening in terms of national attention on race relations and issues.
Right.
And the timing is impeccable. One of the biggest things I always suggest and encourage people to do is that when you're taking on these initiatives, you need to have somebody that you can consider sort of like a jack of all trades. In baseball, I think it'd be called a utility person.
A utility player.
Utility player.
Yeah.
So you need someone like that in your cabinet level, because what they do is they're able to add different perspective and value to the conversation that normally isn't added. And a lot of folks say, well, should it be a director position? Should it be an assistant superintendent position? In our cabinet, it's an assistant superintendent position. And I feel like it's critical, because I think that what my superintendent would argue is that there's a perspective that's unique that oftentimes isn't brought to the table, right? And so, like, when you're thinking through, like, how do you do this work and implement it and then sustain it, you need to have a counter. You need to create the space. One of the beauties of my relationship with my superintendent is we're very honest with each other. Like, I have a deep respect and commitment towards him, because he creates the space to have these actual conversations. And I can say to him, like, hey, these are things that I don't think are working well.
Right.
Know that he's reflecting and thinking about it, and he's not personalizing it. He's more so trying to, and even when it's hard, right, we're still able to have a challenging conversation, have a beer afterwards. And it's not, like
that's great.
It's not this sort of personalized experience. So that's critical in terms of when you're thinking through this sort of sustaining this work. And after the audit, you got to have somebody at the senior leadership level that's empowered to be transparent and honest, because it's not always going to be roses. And we have to protect, and this is culture building, right? We have to protect our staff members, even the ones that are very challenging for us to hear, the ones that might not deliver the message in the way that we want to hear, the ones that might be very critical in terms of some of our practices, because they're inherently, they're communicating to us, which tells us that even if we don't want to hear it, they're trusting to some extent, even if it's a minimal amount of trust, our willingness to engage in the process and to reflect on our practices to see if we can improve them or not.
And I think they're showing they're invested in trying to make it better.
Absolutely.
Too. So Joe, you really very nicely segued into my my last question, which was, but it's actually my last question is 2 parts. One is, which you really started us, you gave great advice to districts considering equity audits and engaging in this work.
Mhm.
If you have additional advice building on what you just said, I would love to hear that. And also, if you are you receiving questions from others about this work, and what types of questions are you, or what are you hearing from colleagues in other districts, I guess is the question.
So the first question is additional advice,
Additional
and
advice.
that probably
Sure.
gets to more. I would characterize that as where we're going within the work. So additional
Okay.
advice I would give is that you really need to embed professional development within your contracts. So
Okay.
part of, we're getting ready to go into a contract year. The superintendent is fully committed to working with our union to negotiate to have mandated anti-racism training across the board in every contract, including his and mine and the other assistant
Mm-hmm.
superintendents and
Mm-hmm.
directors, because what the lens around it is that our philosophy needs to be that we indoctrinate people into our core beliefs, our mission, and our values, rather
Yeah.
than making assumptions that they adopt them when they come in. And so we have to teach people how to have respective discussion and dialogue, how
Mm-hmm.
to be uh, reflective, how to have challenging conversations, understanding what institutional racism is and how it's perpetuated within the education today,
Mm-hmm.
understanding how to work and diversify our strategies for youth and meeting them where they're at. And so that has to be if we're going to prioritize and we're going to say this is important, then we need to ensure that it's important and that there's accountability to it. So putting that within a contract, negotiating that with the unions, like that's critical to this work. You also have to put money, you have to put money behind these resources. Like we're going into
Yeah.
universal pre-K, we have a substantial amount that we've committed. It's not going to get us 100% there by the end of this year, but it's a really strong start and it's coming out of our operating. So it's not like this is going to be something that goes away in a year or two. We're putting our money and our resources where our mouths are. We're looking at the existing resources within the district to see if they're being fully utilized or if there are places that we can take that money and better invest that to get stronger results. And that's challenging because in any education
Yeah.
system, people are very nervous about losing resources or seeing them go into a different direction. We're
Mm-hmm.
getting ready to kick off uh, our wraparound program, hiring 4 new wraparound coordinators for the first time and a wraparound manager, because prior to the audit, it was very clear that there's a number of needs that many of our families who've been marginalized experience that require a much more intensive amount of support. So part of what we're trying to do
Yes.
is provide the system with the supports that they need and the flexibility so that our support team is not overwhelmed with their caseloads and unable to provide, maybe the 10 or 15% of families that need that extra amount of support and handholding, the resources that they need, but also to think about the culture in which our schools are created, right, and exist now, and whether they actually are as welcoming as we can make them in terms of some of our families who, can't attend a PTO meeting or doesn't have the capacity
Right.
to show up to a Know Your School night, or maybe loses a half a day of pay because they have to come in and do a parent conference. Like, how do we start to think critically about those practices? The final question, remind me what that was. I don't want to lose track.
It was just if you're getting questions about this work from colleagues in other districts.
All the time.
Okay.
I get
Okay.
phone calls from, it's interesting. I got phone calls from the Dakotas,
Wow.
from Florida, the Carolinas, all across Massachusetts, Connecticut. And people always want to know, what's my job description? What do I do? How did I end up within this work? When you're looking at the audit, like how did you prioritize sort of areas around the audit? What were some of your challenges? How did you identify a consultant? How much money should you invest? What I say to folks is that you got to go with less for an audit than more. This is not, some folks are going to look at an audit and say, it's going to tell us all that's wrong with the district.
Everything in the kitchen sink.
That's
Yeah.
the wrong approach. Take 3 to 5 initiatives that you really are excited about, or 3 to 5 areas that you feel like are challenges that you want more information about, and specifically lay out with the questions that you want answered. Right?
Okay.
Ask detailed questions on what you want answered. Because one of the challenges we had is that our initial school committee that created the RFP then turned over, the entire equity subcommittee turned over because they went on
Oh, wow. Okay.
to city council, and some that just left politics in general. So I had a new school committee come in, and they had different priorities and areas and questions that they had. So even when our reports were coming in around the audit,
Wow.
they were asking questions that had nothing to do with our priority list in terms of some of the areas. And so what we had to do is, essentially say, like, this audit focused on these areas, go back to the RFP, and like there's places for additional work afterwards. But we're going to have to figure out how we roll that out, because like with the areas that we have like a 3-year rollout plan that Mass Insight was help gracious enough to like sort of put together for us. That's a lot of work for 3 years, and we're already behind realistically because of COVID. So now we're having to sort of look at that 3-year model and see, which components from year 1 or 2 need to get pushed back to year 2 or 3, and honestly, from year 3 probably to year 4. So what you want to do in this process is be very clear what you want to ask. Make sure you have the data readily available for the consultant so they can access it, right? Like you don't want to get to a place where you're searching and looking for data and you don't have it, and it's time. And then make sure that you're budgeting honestly for some incentives for families. You want families to show up, give them a $25 gift card. You want kids to show up, give them pizza, some salad, and some water or juice. You've got to be online. See if you can get a community partner, because I know a lot of schools will say, well, we can't give out Visa gift cards. Well, let's see if you can partner with a community organization that has more flexibility and they can give it to the kids.
Yes, good advice. Yeah.
That way you're not relying on people's goodwill, because it's oftentimes it's the people who are experiencing the greatest hardship that we're asking to give more to figure out how we can be better at what we do. And so that being better at what we do means like reflecting on your practice and your intentionality. If you want people to show up, you better have childcare, you better have food, you better have translation, and it better be at a time that they can make it, because otherwise they're not going to show up. And that's more than fair in terms of like if you're asking people to give up some of their time and honestly to communicate about issues that are probably extremely like sensitive to them, right? Challenging issues.
Yeah. So I want to thank you so much again for sharing your time and your expertise. And I want to commend you and Superintendent Tremblay and everyone in Framingham for engaging in this vitally important work. Thank you so much.
No problem. Appreciate the time.
All right. Take good care, Joe.
Bye.
Bye-bye.